I've produced 2 videos that tell of my dad's experiences in World War II. The short version tells his stories but limits discussion of the broader historical context, while the longer version spends more time putting Dad's stories in the context of where and when. I produced these videos over 20 years after Dad's death. Since I knew the 2 ships he sailed on, I was able to get the history of his movements and even find some video and pictures that enhanced his individual experiences. His stories come from 3 sources: a taped conversation he had with a cousin of mine, stories my Uncle George told me years ago, and finally a handwritten letter he drafted talking about Guadalcanal. I put this video together with the sole purpose of preserving not only my dad's stories, but his voice, which means a lot to me when I hear it. My hope is, should future generations ever become curious about their family tree, this video may be of interest to them. While producing this video, it dawned on me that my dad's experiences could be scenes from a war movie. He was on a ship that got torpedoed and sunk, killing almost half the crew. On another occasion, he had to bail out of his airplane and spend the night on a coral outcropping in shark-infested waters before swimming to an island where he was rescued by local islanders. On another occasion, his airplane was destroyed by an equipment malfunction while being hoisted back onto his ship. The ship was sailing to engage the enemy, so it didn't return to rescue my dad for several hours. He also landed his seaplane on Guadalcanal the day the Marines began their invasion. He must have been one of the first airplanes to land on Guadalcanal, since most of the airplanes supporting the invasion were carrier-based. And finally, during his last 2 battles, he witnessed the sinking of one of his sister ships and was again hit by a torpedo, but survived the attack and was able to limp home for repairs. It's hard to imagine what it must have been like floating around the Pacific for hours and hours, wondering if anyone will be able to find you. There were no radio beacons or life rafts, just you and your life jacket. His combat duty only lasted a year or so. It was cut short when he came down with malaria and sailed home on a hospital ship, which is a story in itself. My guess is the time he spent on coral reefs or floating around the ocean were contributing factors. My father, Perry Roberts, was a career Navy pilot. He completed flight training and got his wings in January 1942, a month after the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor. My dad never had much to say about the war, but I picked up bits and pieces during his lifetime. I spent the summer of 1964 working for my Uncle George, Dad's oldest brother. George told me several intriguing stories during my stay with him. In 2012, 13 years after my dad's death, a long-lost cousin of mine, Francis Termo, sent me an audio tape of a conversation he had with Perry in February 1994 regarding Dad's World War II experiences. The taped interview had a few new stories in it, along with Perry's side of the stories Uncle George had told me. The audio file contained about 30 minutes of conversation around 5 war stories. The proliferation of historical information on YouTube and other sources has allowed me to put Perry's spoken word into a broader historical context. To create that context, I've attempted to answer 4 questions: what, when, where, and why. The why was easy to answer. World War II had started. Perry was in the Minnesota National Guard and had an active duty commitment upon graduating from college. It's been much more challenging to answer the what, when, and where questions. It's also been a challenge to weave Perry's stories into the broader historical context. It's now August 2022. I've created a series of movies that attempt to preserve Perry's stories before they are forgotten forever. This movie attempts to answer the question, what did Perry do in the war? At the beginning of World War II, search radar was not being used effectively on ships. Battleships and battlecruisers relied on their float planes to be their eyes. Perry flew a Curtiss SOC Seagull, a float plane built to be catapulted off of ships and to be hoisted back onto them after each mission. The O in the name meant observation. SOCs were used to direct the ship's guns to targets it was unable to see. The S in the name meant scouting. The SOCs were used to locate enemy surface ships and submarines. The Seagull had a top speed of 165 miles per hour. The Seagull had a range of 675 miles at a cruising speed of 133 miles per hour. The Seagull had a pilot and a observer gunner radioman. However, radios were never used in combat areas. Ships and aircrafts all operated under radio silence. The Seagull had 4 fixed machine guns facing forward, operated by the pilot, and 1 rear-facing gun operated by the rear gunner. It could also carry 2 bombs. Perry served on 2 different battle cruisers, the USS Quincy followed by the USS St. Louis. Both of these cruisers were 600 feet long and 60 feet wide at midship. Both had a top speed of 37 miles per hour. Their range was 11,000 miles at a cruising speed of 17 miles per hour. Each ship had 4 SOCs on board and a crew of 800 to 900. The 2 movie segments that follow show the takeoff and landing processes unique to seaplanes. The narrator in the second segment, which was filmed in 2008, was no doubt on the St. Louis when Perry was on it.
Today, we're looking at an aircraft that was built with somewhat old-school thinking, but still managed to outlive other models that were later designed to replace it. This was the Curtiss SOC Seagull. In terms of operational use, with the exception of carriers, all SOCs operated on a single float and were launched from shipboard catapults while at sea. After completing a mission, the recovery process was rudimentary but effective. The ship would make a large, sweeping turn by which the ship's wake would produce a relatively calm area of sea for the plane to land upon. Once on the water, the pilot would taxi alongside the ship, which would be towing along a so-called plane trap, which was basically a giant reinforced net. The plane had a rearward angled bar that acted like a hook underneath the float, so that when it came up over this net, the pilot simply had to power down for the plane to be caught. The observer would then...
The cruisers were supposed to range out ahead of the fleet, and we were supposed to find the enemy. And then to extend the range of their ships, we would have these planes, and they would get out ahead of us. It was called an SOC, Scout Observation, made by Curtiss. The nickname for it was the Seagull. The ship started making a starboard turn to create a slick, and the pilot had to be coming in at precise time so that he can land in that slick. And you see, he's just bouncing a little bit, and the waves are not affecting him. There's a spring-loaded device there that catches on the sled, and then you train your aircraft crane around, and the man in the back seat hooks it on, and you pick the plane up, and you put it down on top of a catapult. They use those planes for a lot of other things, too. When you were firing at the beach and you didn't know where your projectiles were landing, you had to do what they call spotting, and these pilots were trained to spot, to tell us where the projectiles were landing so that we could adjust the angle of fire. When our fighters and other kinds of aircraft would get shot down and they'd wind up in the water, well, these planes did yeoman service picking up downed pilots.
In this movie, I answer 2 questions. Where did Perry serve, and when was he there? Perry spent a total of 9 to 10 months in the war zone. All of his time was spent in the Solomon Islands campaign, which lasted from July 1942, with the Marine landings at Guadalcanal, to December 1943, when the Japanese surrendered the island of Bougainville. The Solomon Islands are approximately 500 miles east of New Guinea in the South Pacific Ocean. The island chain starts with Bougainville at its northwesterly point and continues in a southeasterly direction about 500 miles to Guadalcanal. The Japanese invaded Bougainville in March 1942, and by June they occupied the entire island chain, including Guadalcanal. The channel between Bougainville and Guadalcanal ultimately became known as the Slot. Both the Japanese and Allied naval forces operated in the Slot generally at night and ran for cover during the day to avoid attacks from each other's aircraft. The water around Guadalcanal became known as Iron Bottom Sound because so many warships were sunk there. Guadalcanal was a very important strategic location. If the Japanese were able to build an airstrip on Guadalcanal, they could disrupt supply lines between the U.S. and Australia. This could place Australia at risk of invasion and potentially impact the outcome of the war. Perry's first combat action took place when the U.S. and its allies attacked Guadalcanal on August 5, 1942. They destroyed the Japanese airstrip before it was completed. Perry's ship, the USS Quincy, was sunk on August 9th while defending Guadalcanal in the Battle of Savo Island. Perry was rescued and returned to the U.S. to be assigned to a new ship. In late December 1942, Perry returned to the Solomon Islands on the USS St. Louis. The Battle of Guadalcanal ended in February 1943 when the Japanese surrendered the island. Between February and June, the St. Louis routinely patrolled a 200-mile stretch of the Slot between Guadalcanal and Kolombangaro Island. The purpose of these patrols was to intercept the Tokyo Express, the name given to ongoing Japanese ships attempting to resupply their island garrisons. After the Battle of Kolombangaro on July 12th, Perry became seriously ill with malaria and was transferred to Maryland Hospital in Alameda, California. After recovering from malaria, Perry was precluded from returning to combat for fear of contracting malaria again. My father, Perry Roberts, completed flight school on January 16, 1942, just over a month after the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor. Immediately after graduation, he traveled to Iceland for duty on the USS Quincy. On January 25th, the Quincy left Iceland, headed for New York Naval Shipyard to be equipped for battle in the Pacific. While the ship was being equipped, Perry spent his time training with the Marines that he will ultimately support in the Pacific. He also took time off to marry my mother in Norfolk, Virginia on April 18, 1942. On June 5th, Quincy left New York, arriving in San Diego on June 19th. In early July, Quincy sails to the Solomon Islands in the Pacific, joining a naval task force in late July that will support the invasion of Guadalcanal. On August 5th, the Guadalcanal campaign commences. Quincy bombards suspected Japanese positions as Marines invade the island. Perry, in his Curtiss SOC aircraft, acts as a spotter to direct Quincy's guns on enemy targets. On August 9th, the Quincy is sunk during the Battle of Savo Island. Perry, along with other survivors, spends 10-plus hours in shark-infested waters until they are rescued. The Battle of Savo Island was one of the worst U.S. Navy defeats in World War II. Immediately after his ship is sunk, Perry returns to Alameda, California, awaiting assignment to a new ship.
But the Quincy went down, we picked up the Marines that had been down there training, and then we went up and put them ashore, and prior to putting them ashore, of course, we bombarded the island, and there was nothing there to bombard. There were no troops on the island. It was an unopposed landing.
What was it, torpedo got the Quincy?
I suspect several torpedoes. Not sure.
Probably from a submarine?
Not so fast, it had to be submarines.
Yeah.
Well, no, it wasn't submarines, it was Japanese destroyers and cruisers all carried torpedoes, so I think it was probably cruisers that launched the torpedoes, or their surface ships anyway. I don't think there's any historical evidence that they had submarines in those confined areas.
I guess it didn't take the ship long to sink.
Less than a half an hour is my recollection.
Oh.
So it had to be torpedoes and probably hit the magazine or something.
Were we in the water very long?
I don't know, I blacked out, I don't remember. Still daylight, anyway, for 8 or 10 hours, I suppose.
Destroyer probably pick you up?
Oh, yeah. No, that destroyer came by during the night and said, we've got you spotted, we'll be back, because they were still worried about submarines, I think.
Yeah.
Worried about the outcome. So they stuck to their word, they came back and picked us up a day.
After my dad died, my sister found a tablet containing a handwritten letter to the author of a book describing the sinking of the USS Quincy. It doesn't appear that Dad was contradicting anything in the book, but just passing on his personal story, as well as his high regard for the ship's captain, Samuel N. Moore. Dad's incomplete letter reads as follows. I was ordered to Iceland, where I reported for duty on the Quincy. In March 1942, Quincy went to the Navy Yard in New York to get radar installed. Then we went to NAS Norfolk. We had wheeled landing gear installed on our float planes and trained with Marine artillery units to spot their artillery fire. This involved correction in range and bearing to bring targets under fire. In June, we went through the Panama Canal and then to the South Pacific. Marines assigned to Guadalcanal invasion provided maps of Guadalcanal. My gunner radioman and I were both trained as spotters, but the Marines decided their own officers would do the spotting. My ship, the Quincy, along with Vincennes and Astoria, were assigned to Guadalcanal landing, along with the Australian cruiser Canberra. By mid-morning, the Marines had their artillery ashore and requested an aerial spotter, which was Quincy's responsibility. Shortly before launch time, I reported to Captain Moore on the bridge. He asked, "How much wind do you need over the catapult?" When I answered 5 knots was adequate, he said, "If you decide that you'd like more, just let me know and I'll give you as much as you want." What now may seem like a small thing sure meant a lot to a green pilot on his first mission. How could I not do my utmost best to fly a successful mission? I will never forget Captain Samuel N. Moore, commanding officer, USS Quincy. I will always feel privileged to have served under him. When the Marine Corps spotter, whose name I've forgotten, and I arrived over the landing area, everything seemed to be going well. Unloading was continuing while some Marines were enjoying a swim and probably their first good bath in weeks. The Marines' first salvo was fired at the mouth of a small river close to Henderson Field, the airport the Japanese had started to build. The Marine spotter asked me if plus 500 yards was enough correction in range. Since the theory was that the first spot should never be short to ensure you don't hit friendlies, I suggested a minimum of plus 1,000 yards. He accepted my guess and gave his artillery buddies a correction of plus 1,000 yards in range, no correction in deflection. The second salvo landed dead center on target, which proves something about beginner's luck. Since the Marines' artillery didn't need us anymore, I suggested we look around instead of going back to the Quincy immediately. We cruised along the coast. We observed an area cleared of underbrush and well trampled, with a Japanese flag flying from a tall pole. We couldn't detect any signs of life. There was lots of room amid the palms. It was probably an assembly area for workers who came over from Tulagi each day. My Marine spotter wanted to get the Jap flag for a souvenir, so I landed, a not so smart move. We discussed who would go and get the flag. I knew I couldn't go back without him, and he knew he couldn't get back without me, so we canceled the stupid maneuver and flew back to Quincy without the flag. Other pilots from the Quincy were assigned to anti-sub patrol during our stay. I'm not aware that pilots from the other two cruisers in our division did anything. However, it was evident to me that our carrier fighters were working over the Japanese bombers that had been sent to break up the landings. I believe one of our transports was hit by a bomber at Guadalcanal. The few bombers that I saw from the Quincy were obviously hugging the water and running for home. They made no attempt to bomb us. I also remember the evening before we were sunk. It was known that a force was headed our way and could arrive at approximately 2 a.m. Our executive officer and Tom Chisholm, one of our pilots, were discussing why we didn't fly out to find the convoy and attack them. The XO explained that our responsibility was to protect the transports. My dad never completed the letter, nor did he write about the sinking of the Quincy. While searching for stock footage for Perry's World War II movies, I Googled the term USS St. Louis reunions. A video from a 2008 reunion popped up. That video, which follows this introduction, contains a brief interview with a catapult operator. He tells a story of an event so unique and consistent with Perry's story of a similar event that it leaves little doubt that the crewmen and Perry were on the St. Louis at the same time. Their stories.
Down in Espiritu Santo one day, we had sent our planes out, a couple of them, I guess, and when they returned, one of them pulled up to the stern of the ship in Baker Recovery to be picked up, and the pilot had got the plane in position, and he wanted the guy in the rear to hook the plane with that strap onto the hook of the crane. There was no one in the rear seat. The guy was gone. Never found out what happened. He jumped or fell out. Anyway, he wasn't there.
Fred Silverthorne was flying on my wing, and he got vertigo. And I suddenly saw him go right up over right over like that. And so we immediately broke everything up, and finally he came back and joined me. So we canceled the operation and went back, and his radioman had bailed out, and part of the parachute was still hung up on the gun. So he'd apparently opened it too soon, or got ran into when he recovered. He finally got back. He got, I suppose he was staring at me to keep position, and got vertigo and just rolled right over you. And then he got his head on straight and recovered and was pulled up. In the meantime, the radioman, I guess, thought he was spinning in and bailed out. We never could find him. I remember searching for him. We thought it was a possibility that he might survive with parachute partially deflated.
This movie tells two versions of the story of Perry bailing out of his airplane. The first section is Perry's version of the story as told to Francis in February 1994. The second section is my memory of the story George told me in 1964. There's a small world component to George's story that has been etched in my mind for almost 60 years.
We're talking about bailing out. That's okay. We were in Espiritu Santo, I know, because we used to go back there to refuel and reprovision after being up at Guadalcanal, and radar was so new that it wasn't really, people didn't know much about it, so we always practiced every chance we got. So, on that day, whatever date it was, I took off and was to fly out on a southwest heading for 10 or 15 miles and back because pretend I was an intruder. And the ship was going to direct out another airplane, one of my friends. And the weather was kind of stinky, so I climbed up to altitude, got above the overcast, and no one ever came out. Apparently they never picked me up.
Oh.
And so I flew back and forth a few times. No one ever came up to intercept me. So decided to go home. And I started let down, heading towards the ship. And of course, this is all just strictly dead reckoning.
You did? Oh, sure.
Anything except flying a heading, and I didn't know what the winds were, of course. Sure. As I was letting down, the engine quit.
Oh, no.
And I checked, apparently had all kinds of fuel, but the engine couldn't get it started. And I knew that the hills around there were about 2,500, 3,000 feet high, so I thought my position was so unsure that I couldn't gamble on letting all the way down to the water.
Because you might have been over land, you mean?
I might have been over land. Yeah. So Hardin, who was my radioman gunner, said, "You go and I'll follow you." And he got out, I went out. About 30 seconds later, I was in the clear. If I'd have stayed with it about another 30 seconds, I could have landed.
Hmm.
And he was a pretty good swimmer. I wasn't doing very good. I don't know why that May rested with my arms raw. So I come go on, come on in, don't wait for me. So he got into the island, and I didn't quite make it that night. I got a little off course and wound up on just a small coral outcrop that was probably a half mile from the island. Sat there all night until I could see again. You know, it's tropical nights sometimes are pretty black. So ever since I've hated crabs. The next morning, an airplane comes flying by looking for me, and I had my life jacket and they didn't see me, and flew right by me, didn't see me. A couple of times. I found out afterwards they thought I'd crashed in the hills, and they were up there looking for me.
Oh.
Well, in the meantime, the radioman, natives got the radioman back to the ship. And I figured they'd given up looking for me, so I swam across to the island. I really don't remember much except they sewed up my flight suit, which was ripped on the coral. Cut my hands up, tried. So they got word somewhere or other to the ship, and they came over and got me by one of the seaplanes. But I don't know why they really how you can fly by a person out there like that, but it can happen.
Well, he was looking out the other side of the airplane.
Well, I got two people. One guy searched one side, one the other, but apparently they all looked in the same direction. They were going to some specific area to search and weren't looking on the way. He was right by me a couple of times.
They didn't have the old signal flares in those days.
Oh, heck, we had nothing in the way of emergency equipment.
No. Life
jacket was all they had. But I guess one of the things I did was tie the ripcord to my flight suit in case saved it. That's kind of funny.
Yeah.
Just something I did.
Yeah.
I still got it here.
Huh.
So that's the end of that story.
Now the next
Of course, when I went aboard ship and had to go see the captain, had to hear the whole story and what happened. And eventually there was what do you call it, a accident investigation. They what's it like to bail out, and then they were bailed out of an airplane. The result was they assumed that the carburetor ice got quit. But I don't know. You never will know, of course.
No, you never will know.
I did know that the airplane sunk. Anyway.
Yeah, they never found it.
I spent the summer of 1964 with my Uncle George, my dad's oldest brother. He told me the following story. It's a small world story that relates to the story you just listened to. George was 6 years older than my dad. When they were growing up on the farm, my Uncle George and his friend, let's just call him John, were riding on a horse-drawn water tanker when my dad fell off and was seriously injured. George and his friend rushed my dad to the local doctor. Fast forward to after World War II, my dad returns home and tells George this story. I had to bail out of my airplane once and had to swim to an island off in the horizon. I couldn't make it by nightfall, so I spent the night on a coral reef. I was exhausted and all cut up by the coral. I didn't think I would make it to the island, but I got a boost from the current and made it to the beach. I was in pretty bad shape, but some natives found me and took care of me until they could get word to the Marines that they had found a downed pilot. The story goes on to say that Dad caught malaria and was again in bad shape. When he was put on a hospital ship, a doctor making rounds looked at his dog tags and said, "My best friend George Roberts has a younger brother named Perry." When the doctor found out that my dad was George's brother, he said, "The last time I saw you, you were seriously injured, and now I see you again and you're seriously ill. I'm sure you'll recover, but we should both hope that I never see you again." In this movie, Perry tells Francis about the time a hoist malfunction caused Perry's airplane to be dropped into the water, where it is torn apart by the ship's prop wash. Perry and his radioman spend several hours at sea before his ship is able to reverse course and find them.
What happened the time that you get dropped in the drink, as they say?
Well, I guess you have to sort of understand the recovery procedure, I suppose.
Mm-hmm.
The ship is underway, and how do you get back aboard it?
Yeah.
And it's kind of a long, drawn-out explanation, but the ship would, depending on the situation, they would turn 45 degrees to the wind, and then make a 90-degree turn across the wind. And then that made a slick that you could land in.
Oh, how about that?
It would smooth out the water quite a bit. And of course, they're still going at 15 or 20 knots. I don't know what the speed would be. It's roughly that. But then while they were doing this, they drug, what do you call the thing? A davit out over?
Yeah, I know what you mean.
With this big long pole.
Yeah, yeah. The same thing when you're coming aboard a ship, you get on.
Anyway, they had what's called a sled dragging from this thing.
Mm-hmm.
It was a rope, mesh rope. And the airplane had a hook on it that was spring-loaded.
Uh-huh.
Drive up on the sled, and then when you cut the engine, it would come back and hook a rope.
Yep.
So they were going the same speed as the ship then. And I normally did, I suppose, radioman could do it. I could stand up in the cockpit and open up a compartment on top of the wing and take out a long cable, hook it onto the sling they'd drop a hook and you'd hook on the sling, then they'd lift you up. And as quick as they lifted you up, then the rope would drop loose. In this case, we got about, 10 or 15 feet in the air, and something happened. The clutch on the hoist released, or somebody did something wrong, something broke, dropped the airplane into the water. Well, then we're being towed by the top of the airplane, so it just went cartwheels. And of course, the catapult, that area is just about opposite the screws. So when we went into the water, we're tumbled by the propeller wash. And came up half a mile, quarter of a mile astern. And airplanes came up searching for us, and they couldn't find us. Another instance, they knew exactly where we were. All they had to do was backtrack on the ship's wake, and they couldn't find us. So I suppose an hour, maybe a little longer than that. And the task force command, well, they're not a task force, a task group or task unit, 3 cruisers, the admiral in charge, reversed course, and had the gunnery optics searching. And then how they found us, their gunnery optics. And then the destroyer came over and picked us up. But the airplanes couldn't find us. Flew right over and couldn't see us.
Was the airplane, I guess it's sunk then, right?
Well, I think they hoisted the board, but the wings were torn off and all that just to get rid of it. There's no way to release it.
Oh, sure.
The airplane was completely destroyed.
So you got thrown out of the airplane when this happened, I guess.
Well, quick as it flipped, we were gone, because I was standing up and the rigging was unbuckled, when you land.
In a prior movie, the story of Perry's airplane being destroyed was told. Since he didn't have an airplane, he was assigned to the command tower of the St. Louis, where he monitored the ship's radar. He was monitoring radar in both the Battle of Kula Gulf and Kolombangaro, both of which occurred in early July 1943. Perry watched the USS Helena sink and disappear from radar in the Kula Gulf battle. In the Kolombangaro battle, the St. Louis was hit by a torpedo and returned to port for repairs after the battle. Upon returning to port, Perry catches malaria and boards a hospital ship bound for the U.S. World War II is over for him. The movie that follows has two parts. The first part is the battles explained by a naval historian. The second part is a discussion of the battles during Perry's conversation with Francis.
Following a brutal 6-month campaign that included a number of primarily cruiser-based battles, but which also included battleships and other large ships, the Allies have secured Guadalcanal at the southern end of the Solomon Islands. Now, both the Imperial Japanese and the Allies have major bases with air bases and fleet units attached in the Solomon Island chain. And that chain runs more or less north to south, just east of Australia and north of the Coral Sea. So the Allies now control Guadalcanal in the south, and the Japanese still have a major base in the northern Solomons, where they have airfields and naval units based and whatnot. So the Allies have to continue to advance up the Solomon Islands to get to the Japanese major base to throw them out. And the Japanese are not in a position to launch a counterattack, but they have to decide where they're going to draw their next defensive line. So the Allies are landing in the New Georgia group, which is in the Central Solomons, and islands that World War II fans might have heard of from here are Vella La Vella, Kolombangaro, and Rendova. Rendova is where the Allies choose to make their next attack. In that area, the Japanese have a small airfield. They don't tend to base aircraft there, but it makes a good place for their aircraft to stop if they're damaged or if they need to refuel on the way to Guadalcanal or on the way back. So the Allies want to take this airbase and deny that to the Japanese. When Halsey, who is in control of the Southwest Pacific area, learns that a Tokyo Express run is going to happen. So he orders those ships to turn around and go back out there to the Kula Gulf, where he expects these Tokyo Express destroyers to come. So the American force is led by Admiral Ainsworth, and it's 3 Brooklyn-class light cruisers: Honolulu, St. Louis, and Helena. They're also all equipped with radar by this point in the war, and they know how to use it. And these 3 light cruisers are being escorted by the destroyers Nicholas, O'Bannon, Radford, and Jenkins. So the Japanese force is coming down in the darkness. The American force picks them up on radar and starts firing with the fast-firing 6-inch guns of their light cruisers and the faster firing but lighter shells of the 5-inch armed destroyers. And this battle ends up taking just under a half hour for the main part of the action before both sides have suffered casualties and pretty much mutually break off the engagement. So the Japanese are caught a little bit flat-footed and do what they do when they're caught flat-footed, which is to say they launch a spread of torpedoes, and the American ships are able to land several hits on Niizuki, the flagship, the lead ship of the column, and they manage to sink her outright with gunfire. And they kill Akiyama in so doing. Meanwhile, the light cruiser Helena has been, because she had done shore bombardment, she used all of her flashless powder. So during this engagement, she's using smokeless powder, which doesn't obscure rangefinders during daytime, optical rangefinders, but it does flash. So at night, this ship, firing 6-inch guns, over a dozen rounds per minute, per barrel, is really lit up. So the Japanese can see her better than any of the other ships, and she takes a torpedo hit and is sunk. And all of the American casualties for the battle come off of Helena. None of the other ships are hit. This one takes place just after our last battle of Kula Gulf. This takes place at Kolombangaro. So coast watchers were able to report back to Admiral Halsey, who commanded the Allied forces in the area, that the Japanese were moving another shipment of troops to the New Georgias. So Halsey tapped Ainsworth, who had previously fought the Battle of Kula Gulf to a draw, essentially losing one cruiser in exchange for 2 Japanese destroyers. And he substituted the lost Helena with the Royal New Zealand light cruiser Leander. The American fleet comes in, and they're all equipped with radar at this point, so they are ready for night fighting, and at a range of approximately 20 miles, which is a pretty good maximum range for their surface search sets operating inside of an island group, they're able to pick up the Japanese fleet. And this is a huge turnaround from the earlier fighting around Guadalcanal, where some of the American ships had radar, some didn't. They didn't know how to use it, or when they did know how to use it, they didn't quite trust it. No, the Americans, they could see the Japanese at 20 miles, and they were ready to spring a trap. And the Japanese don't have radar yet, but they do have a radar detection system, which allowed them to pick up the transmissions of American radar sets. So approximately 2 hours before the Americans actually saw the Japanese knew the Americans were out there, and they could find a bearing where this signal was coming from. So the Japanese were not, in fact, caught off guard. And because the Japanese torpedoes were far better and had a much better range than their American counterparts, they were able to launch their torpedoes first. So the Japanese launched their torpedoes, the Americans launched their torpedoes second, and then start opening up with gunfire, and they have pretty accurate radar ranging information to the Japanese. The Japanese, in order to get this information and find the exact bearing for their target, have to turn on their searchlights. So Admiral Aisaki has Jinsu activate her searchlights to pick out the American ships. And as it turns out, a searchlight goes both ways. So now the American ships knew exactly where Jinsu was, and they concentrated their fire on her and absolutely obliterated her with 5 and 6 inch shells, rapidly firing. So Jinsu was sunk. She was a total loss, and Admiral Osaki was killed. So that's 2 admirals and 2 flagships in as many battles, and basically in as many days. That said, all 3 of the American cruisers ended up taking significant damage. Leander was hit by shellfire, and a torpedo, and she basically wouldn't be repaired in time to participate in the war anymore. Honolulu and St. Louis both had to go back to the United States for permanent repairs.
There were 3 ships. We were the tail end ship because it was the junior captain is the last man alive. The Admiral was on the Honolulu, was the lead ship. Helena was next, and we were third. And I never forget, we used to argue about it. The Helena always went to rapid fire, and you could see that ship like it was sunlight was shining, just like broad daylight when it went to rapid fire. And the other 2 ships always set fire to salvos, so they were dark periods. And I never could figure out why. I know our gunnery office was really ticked off about he didn't like that gunnery office. I don't know why the Admiral didn't lay down the rules, but he didn't. He was captain on his own ship.
Why would we go to rapid fire?
I don't know.
Were they shooting?
They had come down there, and they had been through a couple other scraps with the Japs. So
Were there Japanese airplanes flying then?
oh no, this was at night. We'd go and saw if the Japanese were on their run at that time, but they were trying to come back with troops any way they could by small destroyers, barges, anything to bring them down on the islands.
What were you firing at?
Japanese ships that were bringing down.
Other ships.
Okay.
Uh-huh.
Anyway, we'd go up there night after night. We'd go get up there about midnight and run like hell to get away from air cover. We get air cover the next day. And this night, I think this is the last. Anyway, what we would normally do was escort the ships up and fly back to Guadalcanal and spend the night, and then they'd come back and we'd go aboard again. But they didn't want to keep the airplane, didn't want to waste time recovering, so we'd fly back. At night, you're no good anyway.
Right.
But occasionally, this one trip I somehow or other designated to plot the action. We had radar in the captain's cabin or his duty station. He had radar, and the radar man was in there plotting. And the Helena disappeared.
Off the radar screen?
Well, you keep station.
Sure.
Helena disappeared and couldn't figure what happened. And finally, a destroyer had something on radar, couldn't identify it, and the destroyer lit it up and was the bow of the Helena. And she took several torpedoes and sunk very rapidly. And shortly thereafter, we got the bow blown up. And the Honolulu got hit. So all 3 of us had permission and just like that. But during this, the hatch came off and knocked me on the can. Get some hate. And you say, we're making history, and you're supposed to be recording it. Well, that woke me up right away. It wasn't the regular hit, it was just from the guns firing. One salvo, and the hatch came loose. Didn't hurt, it just knocked it down. Calm and calm, just calm as could be. He didn't call me Mr. Roberts either, so. He didn't call me young man, said, we are making history, and I want you to make sure you record it. So then I went back to port, and I wound up with malaria, and wound up the end of the war for me.
Did you go back to the States then? Or?
Yeah, I went to Maryland Hospital and Alameda.
Well, you had a nurse waiting to take care of you, I guess.
But I was sort of banned from going back to the South Pacific. They said you'd come down with malaria again, so you'd be any good down there.
Yeah.
Finally, then I got, they had carried a class 3 or something. Couldn't fly combat aircraft. That's garbage.
That's all, folks.